everybody, this is Carl with Tabletop Tango today, and today I wanted to talk about a Savage World setting called Legions of Liberty. It's actually kind of a unique and interesting take on super powers in the time of the Revolutionary War. So what's kind of their tagline? And right from the book it says Legion of Liberty is set in an alternate Earth where a tiny percentage of 10 to 15-year-olds have been born in the Americas develop superpowers, while the native peoples have long since included these superhumans in their cultures. The astounding capabilities of these individuals have made the colonization of the Americas imperative to the aggressive, ambitious European powers. So it's based in an alternate world where at the time of the Revolutionary War, and the players play basically folks who have superpowers. And these superpowers aren't based on the superpowers companion. They're based on leveraging arcane backgrounds and the powers in the Suede book, as well as others that the book adds. So let's take a look at it. So I have the page up here, the title page. So let's go find ourselves So here's the table of contents. So we'll do a walkthrough real quick. So it talks about building your characters just as you normally would expect. They talk about how you would do superhuman characters versus non-superhuman characters. There's setting rules that they define. Leveraging no PowerPoints, born a hero, heroes never die, and the creative combat system. Then they talk about powers under stress versus not, so you can, just assume your powers are working if you're not in the stress of battle or what have you. Small section on gear because it really leverages the black powder and weaponry in Suede itself. The only thing they add is a small flintlock pistol that does less damage, easier to conceal. Then it goes into sample characters. And so these include, sort of NPCs you would run, or not, sample characters are the kinds of people that you might run into and interact with. And then finally, American Superheroes talks about sort of those revolutionary times superheroes that you'll run into. And then there's a gazetteer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what's the difference if we talk about creating superheroes? There is the concept of, if you're a superhero, you start with more points. So superheroes, you have the arcane background superhuman edge, and that gives you 1 additional free edge, 3 extra attribute increases, and 5 extra skill points that can be spent on those superpowers. So if I read the book right, each superpower has its own kind of skill associated with it that you leverage. And then you have to build those points up. So it's not like the Superhero's Companion where you can just use those superpowers at will. It's similar. It's normal powers, but instead of having one aligned to it, you have to have different points and different skills to associate with each one of those powers that you might have. So we talk about they also talk about if you want non-superhero characters, well, those would start at seasoned, so that they could, actually be somewhat competitive and useful. So there's also a set of new edges that are in the book, and those are, they're just add some flavor. There's nothing too, pardon the pun, revolutionary here. They really align with the fact that, we're talking about superhero characters. Like, for example, they talk about natural weapons here. So a superhuman can have claws, ranged natural weapons. So if you remember the superpowers companion, there's the idea of there's ranged superpowers versus close-in superpowers that get trapped. Power focus, reflexive power. So there's quite a few. There's a couple of hindrances, deserter, you can kind of see these a little bit, but so they add a little bit here, some of flavor. There's not a ton of new edges, but that's okay with me. I don't like the fact if we throw tons of edges and tons of hindrances. I prefer something that's more targeted to the setting and makes a lot more sense. Then there's a section on new powers. So these powers augment what's in Suede because for superpowers, there's some things that are kind of missing there. Like, for example, conjuration. Caster can produce inanimate objects, weight 50 to 200 pounds. That's something that's not really in Suede. And I noticed that as I read through these, some of these things really kind of, I don't know, they mimic what's in the superpowers companion, but that makes sense, right? You're trying to do superpowers, leveraging powers, so why not see things that are very similar? So elementary mastery, energy weapon, energy transformation, gate, which is kind of like teleportation, but you can move between two locations, by creating a gate between up to 100 miles away. Immunity. So there's quite a few that they add here that really are kind of cool. I mean, they add a lot of nice flavor, and the concept of it's superhumans. These really, so you don't need a superpowers companion. You can really leverage this information as a whole, and obviously that was their goal. So let's see what else is interesting in here. So from setting rule standpoint, they don't add a ton of setting rules to the book themselves, but they leverage no PowerPoints, Born a Hero, Heroes Never Die, Creative Combat. They have a little sidebar here on mask battles where what I took away from it is basically the characters really wouldn't be taking place in these large battles, using the mass battle rules. It's more you're in the trenches making a difference to the battle. And then the concept of powers under stress, in non-stressful situations, you can just use them and leverage them. So like I said, they only add really almost no equipment or gear that's not already in Suede. And then they go through some sample characters. These, you get a feel for how the character generation gets put together, what these edges would look like. I'll just leave it on here for a second. So there's a lot of characters that are, give you kind of that flavor so that you can really understand how this all works. And so here's an example. I talked about how earlier in the book, from a powers activation standpoint, there's a skill associated with the powers. So you can see here, you can see here that there's actual skills for the elemental, the entangle, telekinesis, and each one of these has to be raised independently to take advantage of those powers that the person would have. So elemental manipulation, telekinesis, entangle. So that's what I meant earlier when I was talking about how the powers are defined as far as skills, and that's what drives the activation versus like some kind of arcane background skill. So lots of good stuff there. And then the American superhero section is just that. It talks a little bit about the history of superheroes in the Americas. And one of the concepts here is that it's really the Americas that have something about them that create superhumans. And colonists who are born colonists who are born in the colonies, they may present these capabilities, and then that led to superhero legions, people working, as part of the British Army, part of the American resistance, and so that's where the superpowers kind of came from. And then there's a little bit of a section on the different areas, the gazetteer, so Iroquois country, Southern West, really just a little bit of flavor. I mean, technically, if you really want to know much about Americas at that period of time, there's tons of resources that you can use to really understand that. And in the end of this book, they give you a bunch of reading, movies, things that you can leverage to kind of understand more that period in American history. Then they go through the 13 colonies, talk a little bit about each one. You notice it's just a little bit of flavor text. It's not, going into detail. And then there's the Game Master section with lots of good information, which I will not go through. There's Foes and Allies section, which has the kinds of people and things that the players would run into. So graycoats, the different orders, native people, that sort of thing. And then there's a plot point campaign. And what's interesting about the plot point campaign is it follows the American Revolution. So you as a character are participating in different events that are part of the American Revolution, which I thought was pretty clever. I didn't get a chance to read through all of the adventures, but it really kind of adds, that flavor that you're part of that part of American history, even though it's an alternate reality. Savage Tales. And then there's an adventure generator based on die rolls. Pretty standard stuff. Not a ton here, as far as variety. 1 to 6, a lot. And so that gives you a little bit of, push in the right direction, but there's not a lot of diversity here. So I think you'd kind of run into having, sort of start having to think the same way over and over again. And then, again, like I mentioned, there's a great suggested media section that says, here's things that you can use to learn about that period in American history, which would allow you to kind of play the game. Because, again, the setting has flavor text for a lot of things, but doesn't go into a ton of detail on the gazetteer or the different colonies or that sort of thing. So that's kind of the walkthrough of this book. It's really kind of unique. I think I'd love to play it. That would be fun. I don't know if I'd do a whole campaign on it. I don't think I'd find players who would be all that interested in going through an entire plot point campaign that follows the Revolutionary War. But I like its take on kind of superpowers, where they're really powers. I did another video on Crystal Heart, which had a very similar thing where the crystals provided powers and it were powers. So this is probably not unique, but if you haven't read up a bunch of different settings, here's one that has, kind of that feel, and you probably could use it for other, basically other games where you want to use powers to define superpowers and just do it in a different time frame. Doesn't have to be in the Revolutionary War. So I think there's a lot to cherry pick from this to do what your campaign needs. So anyway, this was a quick walkthrough, as I'm going to do on occasion, for different settings, just so you get a flavor for them before you go out and maybe purchase them and get a feel for what they offer. So anyway, this was Carl with Tabletop Tango, and Eric will be back with me for another one coming up, and I appreciate everybody watching. Thanks much.